Mr. President, good afternoon. I rise today to address the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to serve on the United States Supreme Court. As we all know, the stakes are always high when this chamber vets and debates and votes to confirm any president's Supreme Court nominees, as we should be. This is, as we know, the highest court in our land. The job comes with a lifetime appointment, not 2 years like they have in the House of Representatives, not 4 years like a president, not 6 years as we have. Lifetime. Lifetime. And as we know, looking at one of our judges on the Supreme Court, who's I think now 85 years old. That could be a long, long time. And those who serve on the Supreme Court make decisions that will affect the lives of millions of Americans, almost every day. That's precisely why we expect presidents to look for the best and the brightest candidates possible. That's why the vetting process in the Senate should be serious and thoughtful. And that's why nominees should strive to be above reproach. Indeed, we all should strive to be above reproach. This absolutely should be one of the toughest job interviews around because the stakes surrounding any Supreme Court seat are just that high. The stakes surrounding the seat vacated by Justice Kennedy may be even higher. The next justice may shift the balance of our nation's highest court for a generation, maybe even longer. The next justice may very well be asked to rule on questions of executive power that test our democracy. And we're fooling ourselves if we refuse to acknowledge that the stakes are so high, in large part because this chamber has yet to reckon with the grave injustice that was done to Merrick Garland into our Constitution in 2016. As many will recall, Judge Garland, who serves as the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court, the highest federal appeals court in our land, was nominated by President Obama over 2 years ago to fill the seat held by the late Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. Shamefully, he was denied any kind of consideration by this body. He waited 293 days for a hearing and a vote that never came. Most Republican senators refused to even meet with him. A good man was treated badly, and so is our Constitution. The unprecedented obstruction our Republican colleagues mounted against Judge Garland was a shameful chapter for the United States Senate. I'm still deeply troubled by those 293 days. I know some of my colleagues are as well. It's unlikely that it's likely that I'll continue to be troubled by them for the rest of my life. We may never agree which side pulled the pin out of the grenade, but we must all recognize that this institution will never be the same if stealing Supreme Court seats and creating one set of rules for Democratic presidents and another set of rules for Republican presidents is the new norm. So, Mr. President, despite the injustice done to Merrick Garland, Justice Gorsuch was ultimately confirmed last year on a bipartisan basis, I might add. And when Justice Kennedy retired earlier this year, President Trump nominated, as we know, Judge Brett Kavanaugh to fill that seat. More than 12 years ago, I met with Judge Kavanaugh in my office here in the Capitol when the Senate considered his nomination to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Back in 2006, I voted my hopes over my fears. Unfortunately, over the last decade, many of my worst fears have come true. I believe that Judge Kavanaugh's extreme record on the bench that has unfolded over the past dozen years stands in stark contrast to the views of most Americans on too many important issues. For example, Americans overwhelmingly support protection for those living with pre-existing conditions. Brett Kavanaugh ruled against upholding the Affordable Care Act in 2011. It's widely expected he would side with conservative justices if and when cases like Texas versus the U.S. come before the court. And if he does, the ACA's protection for people with pre-existing conditions would be invalidated for tens of millions of Americans. And speaking of health care, Americans overwhelmingly support women having the freedom to make their own health care decisions. Brett Kavanaugh, while working in the Bush White House in 2003, wrote in an internal memo stating that Roe versus Wade may not be considered, quote, settled law of the land because the Supreme Court can always overrule its precedent, close quote. Americans also overwhelmingly support independent checks on executive power. We believe that no one in America is above the law. Yet Brett Kavanaugh, in a July 2009 Minnesota Law Review article, wrote that Congress should pass a law to exempt a sitting president from criminal prosecution or investigation. When I learned of this, Mr. President, my reaction was, you got to be kidding. But apparently, he was not kidding. Ironically, that declaration came just 11 years after Brett Kavanaugh played a key role in drafting the Starr Report, which laid out grounds for impeachment of then-President Bill Clinton. But the greatest threat that Brett Kavanaugh may pose is to this country and its people is with respect to our environment. In all my years, I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't want to make sure we have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. A review of Judge Kavanaugh's nearly 300 opinions over the last 12 years, both concurrences and dissents, show Judge Kavanaugh has voted to weaken or block environmental protections a staggering 89% of the time. 89% of the time. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh has never dissented in a case that would weaken environmental protections, and admitted as much in his responses for questions for the record from Senators Feinstein and Harris. In other words, what am I saying? In other words, almost 9 out of 10 times he has sided with those who weaken environmental protections over those that would strengthen them. I fear that if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh could well turn out to be the next Scott Pruitt. We remember him. However, unlike former EPA Administrator Pruitt, whose tenure ended finally after 18 torturous months, Brett Kavanaugh could damage our environment for a quarter century or more if he serves on the Supreme Court. For example, just last year, Scott Pruitt's attempt to delay rules limiting methane emissions from oil and gas drilling was challenged in the D.C. Circuit Court, where Judge Kavanaugh now serves. In that case, Judge Kavanaugh sided with Scott Pruitt and the fossil fuel industry, voting against his colleagues who found Pruitt's delay illegal. Judge Kavanaugh has also attempted to severely limit EPA's authority to regulate toxic emissions and greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. In 2012, he blocked air pollution restrictions covering nearly half of our country, endangering thousands of lives. This is especially concerning to those of us who live in downwind states like Delaware, Mr. President, where over 90% of our air pollution comes from dirty emissions in states to our west that drift across our borders. When I was governor, Mr. President, I could have shut down my state. Every car, truck, van off the road, shut down every business. We would have still been out of compliance for clean air requirements because of the upwind states putting their pollution up in the air and it's simply blowing to Delaware or Maryland or New Jersey or any other state who happens to live along America's tailpipe on the East Coast. Strictly based on Judge Kavanaugh's environmental record on the bench over the past 12 years, I was prepared to vote no on his nomination many weeks ago. Then last week, the Senate and much of our country was riveted by compelling and, I believe, powerful testimony from a private citizen and a victim, Dr. Christine Ford, who came forward to share the most traumatic experience of her life. She stepped forward despite the serious risk that it posed for both her and her family. Death threats, having to move out of her house. And she testified despite being terrified. She did so despite of being unsure that her story would make any difference at all. She did so because she said it was her civic duty to share the truth. She showed a lot of courage, a whole lot of courage. Like many of my colleagues, I've been contacted by sexual assault survivors since Dr. Ford's testimony who have been inspired to come forward and share their stories. It serves as further proof that this problem is not only underreported, but that men and women are victims of sexual assault can, and they do, bury this trauma, not for weeks, not for months, not for years, for decades. And some of our Republican colleagues have acknowledged that Dr. Ford's testimony was credible. But despite her credibility, they say don't see her testimony as reason enough to deny Judge Kavanaugh a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. They say they don't have enough evidence to believe her. Instead, they've painted this as something of a he said, she said situation involving young people. Well, let's look at what he said then. Last week, Judge Kavanaugh, who currently sits on our nation's second highest court, came before the United States Senate and unleashed a torrent of unbelievably partisan attacks. I've never seen anything like it in a testimony before any committee I've served on or known of. He claimed that the allegations against him were fueled by, quote, pin-up anger about President Trump in the 2016 election, close quote. He went so far as to say that the claims were merely, quote, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, close quote. He threatened Democratic members saying, quote, what goes around comes around, close quote. You know, there's an old saying that says, adversity does not build character, it reveals it. Well, that day, Judge Kavanaugh revealed himself to be a partisan during that hearing. And after witnessing the vitriol that Judge Kavanaugh spewed, how could any left-leaning cause think they'd ever possibly get a fair shake from him should their case come before the Supreme Court? His temperament was clearly unbecoming of a judge, let alone a Supreme Court justice. And what's perhaps even more disturbing is that it seems clear that Judge Kavanaugh was willing to be so brazenly partisan in order to appeal to an audience of one, watching the proceedings from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Judge Kavanaugh's testimony last week also raised additional questions regarding his truthfulness. For weeks, my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, including Senators Durbin and Senator Leahy, have raised serious concerns that Judge Kavanaugh may have misled the Judiciary Committee about the extent of his role in the Bush administration helping several controversial judicial nominees navigate the Senate confirmation process. Judge Kavanaugh may have also misled the Judiciary Committee about the extent of his role in the Bush administration, helping shape several controversial decisions in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, including warrantless wiretapping and the right of enemy combatants. And during his most recent hearing about the allegations brought forward by Dr. Ford, Judge Kavanaugh answered several questions about his younger days in ways that were, at best, misleading and at worst, lies under oath. Judge Kavanaugh's less than truthful answers on matters large and small point to a troubling pattern and raise serious questions about his credibility. And even if my Republican colleagues don't want to believe Dr. Ford, and even if they agree that with Judge Kavanaugh's judicial record, the fact that he came before this body and so brazenly misled our fellow senators should, I believe, by itself be disqualifying. Mr. President, before coming to the Senate, I was privileged to serve, as you may recall, as governor of Delaware for 8 years. In that role, I nominated dozens of men and women to serve as judges and in several courts of national prominence, the Delaware Supreme Court, the Delaware Superior Court, the Delaware Court of Chancery, to name a few. And while the roles of those courts differed, the qualities that I looked for in my judicial nominees were similar. I looked for men and women who were bright. I looked for men and women who knew the law. I looked for men and women who had good judgment, who were able and willing to make a decision, including a difficult decision. I looked for men and women with a strong work ethic. I never wanted to nominate somebody for a 12-year term and just sort of like watch them retire on the job. I looked for nominees who were collegial and able to build consensus on courts that had a larger panel. But there were three qualities that were most important to me. Three qualities. Judicial temperament. Impartiality. Treating everyone before them fairly, not showing partiality. And finally, truthfulness. Those three. Judicial temperament, impartiality, and truthfulness. In fact, there was a time in my first term as governor, Mr. President, I denied a sitting justice of the Delaware Supreme Court the opportunity to serve an additional 12-year term because he lacked appropriate judicial temperament. I'm told that was unprecedented. But his judicial temperament and what I thought was appropriate were not one and the same. Mr. President, it gives me no joy to say what I'm about to say. But the temperament that Judge Kavanaugh exhibited in the Judiciary Committee last week wasn't just unacceptable for a Supreme Court justice. It would be unacceptable for a judge in Delaware serving on the Delaware Court of Common Pleas. Last week, in an effort to actually get to the truth and ensure this body could have all the facts before taking such an important and consequential vote, my Delaware colleagues and I called for the FBI to conduct a nonpartisan investigation. Unfortunately, what we ended up with falls far short of what the Senate deserves and certainly what the American people deserve. What we got was a process certainly not designed to inform. If this process was designed to inform, the White House and Republicans would have actually allowed the FBI to speak to the more than 40 individuals whose names Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez submitted as people who could potentially corroborate their accounts. The FBI never talked to any of those people. If this were a process designed to inform, the dozens of individuals who contacted the FBI to share potentially helpful accounts and information would have received calls in response to those concerns. They did not. If this process were designed to inform, the White House and Senate Republicans would have allowed the FBI to expand the scope of its investigation. They did not. If this process were designed to inform, the majority leader would have at least waited to schedule a vote on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination until after we received and read the FBI report. He did not. Sadly, Mr. President, this process has been a sham from the start. I know our president is proud to hail from the state of Louisiana. I'm equally proud to hail from the first state. As you may know, Mr. President, we're called the first state because we were the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, the longest living, most emulated Constitution in the history of the world. One of the fundamental reasons our Constitution and our democracy has endured is because of the intricate system of checks and balances that our founding fathers crafted just up the road in Philadelphia some 231 years ago. The process we've been through here in the last several weeks, unfortunately, makes a mockery of that system of checks and balances. I believe we all must recognize that, to use the majority leader's words, plowing through with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination will diminish the credibility of the Supreme Court as an institution that stays above the political fray. In fact, confirming Judge Kavanaugh will enshrine doubt in every controversial 5-4 decision moving forward from this time. It also calls into question the legitimacy of us, of this very chamber. Let me just say to my colleagues still wavering on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, let me leave you with this. We will not only be judged by voters this November, we're going to be judged by history. We say that a lot. Sometimes it's tried or overstated. This case it is not. We're going to be judged by history in this regard. I would implore each of you that are still thinking this through, trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. Let me urge you to show that we're still worthy of being called the world's greatest deliberative body. Let's show that we have made progress since 1991 in a previous Supreme Court nomination confirmation episode. Let's show that we're willing to take a stand and do the right thing. Because if we're not, any short-term political wins will be forever eclipsed by the permanent stain left on our legacies in this body from which there may be no recovery. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you.